context of the 20th century and looking at other material compared to the photography and the films that we've discussed a little bit earlier, let's think about possibly the most famous painting by Pablo Picasso, one of the iconic images of the 20th century. His painting in 1937 of Guernica. Now, in considering how to represent the interpretation of images within the 20th century, Guernica immediately came to mind. I cover this instance in another course that I teach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in background to our discussion of the painting itself as we go through this introduction. But when I was drawing together all my dictionaries, I found that the 1997 Oxford Dictionary of the 20th Century had part of the Guernica picture on its front cover. So even as something as mundane as a dictionary has this image on it as a representation of the century, perhaps as a whole. Let's bear in mind that more people died in war during the past century than any other. And that may be our lingering historical memory of what went on during that time. The course in which I touch on Guernica is in the context of a third year unit. It's called The Bomb, Atomic Weaponry and Society in the 20th Century. And we start and do the first term as moving from fears of bombing, works of H.G. Wells, speculative fiction before the First World War, all the way up to the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So one of the things that I think is important in explaining that transition is the willingness of societies to accept the mass slaughter of civilians, an escalation of that process as it goes through from the First World War, experiences in the 1930s, and then an intensification in the Second World War that leads to the dropping of the atomic bombs. Now, if you want to put this in context, during the First World War, there was an element of bombing. It was inaccurate. Frequently you find pilots throwing darts and small munitions from their cockpit on infantry formations. We do have the bombing of London via Zeppelins. In fact, it was such a curious and unusual occurrence that various members of the London population came out and pointed upwards to the German airships, raining bombs somewhat inefficiently down on them. It was such an unusual sight. While bombing really wasn't a major contributor to the way that the First World War was settled, we do see the technological development of aircraft and the weaponry they can and the weaponry they can carry becoming more sophisticated as we go through the 1920s and particularly the 1930s. Some of you will be familiar with the phrase of the British politician, later Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, talking in the early 1930s about defence. The phrase, "the bomber will always get through." The fear that such was the nature and development of technology, that defending a large area, a city, civilian residencies, was going to be virtually impossible. So the type of tactic that would need to be employed will be something akin to what we saw after the Second World War, mutually assured destruction, although that term wasn't used in the 1930s to any great degree. We will bomb you, you will bomb us. The deterrent is if you don't bomb us, we will not bomb you. A form of madness, but nevertheless one that became prevalent over long periods of time, and particularly in the presence of nuclear weapons. Now, I would hesitate to express anything like the expertise of my colleague Helen Graham regarding the Spanish Civil War, which ran from 1936 through to 1939. This is a schism in European history, the first real attempts to, on a military basis, put forward a right-wing dictatorship, ultimately under General Franco. In the scale of things, Paul Preston, who has written voluminously on the Spanish Civil War, asks why Guernica remains so important to the collective memory of warfare and the 20th century. In terms of the numbers killed, and I think the 26th of April 1937, one hesitates to describe them as trivial. No death is trivial, but in the scale of the destruction of human lives during war during the 20th century, Preston actually describes it as perhaps small beer, and he's not being disparaging in this regard. If you're considering the bombing of Hiroshima, perhaps 80,000 people died almost instantly. When we're looking at Guernica in 1937, we may be looking at hundreds dead and possibly thousands injured. The reason that historically that it's important is it is deemed to be the first time that we have intensive bombing of a purely civilian target which was not defended. And it is the escalation of the process of mechanical warfare. The First World War was mechanical slaughter of human beings. The very static nature of the battles concerned, and the Western Front particularly, does emphasise this. We tend to think of the Second World War as being far more mobile when face-to-face confrontations took place. Yet our understanding of what happened in the Second World War is a large degree of, quotes, standoff on the Western Front compared to the Eastern Front from 1941 and anything but standoff, 4 years of bloody slaughter once more. When the BBC was going through a series of Millennium Reviews and wanted to consider what was the war of the 20th century, they picked out the Eastern Front. The intensity of destruction there was unparalleled, with perhaps 20 million people dying in direct conflict. Now, we put that into context of the 20th century, and again, if we're looking at those numbers, are those numbers meaningful? Can we actually relate to figures of that size? When it comes to Guernica, it's a relatively small village in the Basque countryside. Yes, it had a small munitions factory, but it wasn't necessarily as tactical a target as we might consider being developed. And there is an element that it is the trialling of a new form of warfare. One of the things that we find, certainly between about 1936 and 1941, is the Germans developing and moving forward with a form of warfare which maximises their technical advantage in trying to defeat the opposition. In the case of Guernica, we're looking at Juncker's Ju-52 transport aircraft, at the time used as bombers, German Heinkel 51s, HE-51s, biplane fighters, but probably more significant in the development of what was to follow. The first uses of Heinkel HE-111s, which became synonymous with the Blitz, and also the Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the fighter escorts that were associated with very much with the Battle of Britain and the defence of the Reich all the way through the Second World War. You have waves of bombing on what turned out to be market day in the late afternoon and the early evening. There was at best small arms fire in response. Practically, we see the destruction of a small town through the use of high explosive and incendiary bombs to terrorise the population. Not purely the population of Guernica, but all of those who learn of it. And it is an opportunity of the Germans in support of Franco's forces to trial and develop their tactics in the use of this form of modern warfare. And it was just a beginning. Now, the reporting of what happened in Guernica was important to its significance overall. George Steer, who was a correspondent for the Times of London, wrote back emotively about the aftermath, relating back eyewitness accounts and commenting on the devastation. Franco's forces actually denied that bombing had taken place. They actually suggested that the Basques had dynamited part of the city themselves, and it was a controversy that went through until the 1970s, the 1980s, and even the 1990s. Franco's reign all the way through the 1970s meant that Guernica's resolution historically took some considerable time. It's accepted in the West as being one of the first instances, if not the first instance, when we actually have this sort of bombing. In considering the legacy of Guernica and the Spanish Civil War, the most obvious example, as I led off this little discussion, is Pablo Picasso's painting. Now, he'd already been commissioned to provide something for a Spanish exhibition within Paris, but was profoundly affected by the reportage that he received. George Steer's newspaper report for the Times was translated and reprinted around the world. Now, Picasso was very careful not to add an additional interpretation to the painting that he produced that year. But we do see this as I said earlier, an image from the 20th century which carries a lot of weight in terms of interpretation and meaning. And the UN actually generated a tapestry of the same picture to be held officially, or rather displayed officially. Such was the way that it carried forward. Now, in that context, it might be useful just to get you to look at the actual picture itself and to reflect upon it. I make no claims of being an art historian, but the fact that it is a monochrome work, as a mural, as a painting, to a certain degree reflects, probably not deliberately, but reflects on the way that we deal with images, and a certain currency is given to black and white. We're more trusting of black and white photographs. For no really good reason. We think of them in terms of being authentic. They are reportage. Colour is almost a diversion. Now, Pablo Picasso had the choice as to how he painted his representation of Guernica from the newspaper reports and from a Spaniard thinking about how his fellow countrymen and women and children were affected by this. And it is a striking image because it displays death in a way that's not intended to be realistic in terms of reportage, but what it does give is the sense of turmoil and anguish and bewilderment that stems from that event. And remember, this is Picasso working not as an eyewitness, but working as someone who is dealing with those who favoured the government side, those who had seen the events, and those who were reporting on it internationally.